Good evening. It's time for us to begin. Sorry, my podium broke. So, great timing. I think I got it fixed there. So, before we get into the lesson this evening, I've asked Hugh if he would lead us in a prayer. Hugh, would you please?
Loving Father, given us. It surrounds us. How can we think but anything that it came from you? We're thankful for the group that meets here and the eldership, guidance that they provide for the deacons and all the work that they do. They all continue to do the best that they can, looking for our souls and taking care of the things of a physical nature, and we ask that you be with their families as well. We know that this is time consuming. We thank you for the time that is set aside during the week that we can meet and refocus. Pray that all the teachers have studied and prepared and are able to deliver their message as they have planned. Be with us in this class as we delve into the study of the Revelation. Help us to recall the purpose of this writing, the impact that it should have on us. We know that there are several in this group and related to those in this group that are suffering physically, financially, spiritually. Pray that we find out how we can help them in these regards, especially for our brethren in South Africa. We pray that they can be replenished with the funds that we are sending, and even more so that rains come so that they can be more self-sufficient as they want to be. Help us to be the example that we need to be to everyone that we come in contact with. Keep us always striving to stay in the light and walk in your paths. By the authority of your Son that we pray. Amen.
Thanks, Hugh. What did we talk about last week? The bowls of wrath. We talked last week about the bowls of wrath, as Stephen said. This was the end of this matter. This was the final judgment that God was going to be bringing upon Rome for the actions that they were committing, the evil immoralities that they were taking part in, and for the evil deeds they were doing against God's people. Everything had been building up to this point. Finally, God's judgment was coming. He was bringing justice on those who were against him and against his people. Following those judgments, we looked at the aftermath very quickly at the end of last week's class, and we saw the two sides. You had God's people, the faithful servants, were celebrating that this had happened and worshiping God for his mercy and for his justice and his righteousness. And then you had the evil, the earth dwellers and the evil people on earth who had been oppressing God's people were mourning, and they were sad because these judgments had come. We find ourselves at a very interesting point in Revelation. If you'll remember chapter 14, which we also talked about last week, in chapter 14, the second angel who brought a message said that immorality, Babylon, the great harlot, would fall. And in chapter 17, that harlot is described. And at the beginning of chapter 18, the people are mourning the fall of Babylon, the harlot. Babylon, the harlot, the immorality of Rome has fallen. And at the end of chapter 19, which was a part of our lesson last week, but we didn't really get to touch on, we had a very important scene that I'm going to cover very quickly. We're not going to read it, but In verse 11 of chapter 19, we're reintroduced to the white rider and his horse. Do you remember who that was? It was Jesus. Okay, we had the white horse and its rider. It was Jesus. We've talked about that symbol a couple times. Week 1, we talked about some of the images we would see of Jesus. When we talked about the seals, we talked about this again. Because this text let us know who the rider was when he was introduced back in chapter 6. The rider was Jesus. And in these verses, you have some expanding detail that we're not going to look at on this rider and his motives, but we've already talked about that in previous weeks. But as you look at the end of chapter 19, you have this war being waged. And read with me in verse 20. Actually, verse 19 of chapter 19. And I saw the beast and the kings of earth and their armies assembled to make war against him who sat on the horse and against his army. And the beast was seized, and with him the false prophet who performed the signs in his presence, by which he deceived those who had received the mark of the beast and those who worshipped his image. These two were thrown alive into the lake of fire, which burns with brimstone. And the rest were killed with the sword, which came from the mouth of him who had sat on the horse, and all the birds were filled with their flesh. You have a gruesome image here, but we have two beings being cast into the lake of fire. We have the first beast and the false prophet. We've seen these. These are images of the sea beast and the earth beast. The earth beast was described previously, back when we talked about that, as being a false prophet. It deceived the men of the earth into worshiping the first beast. And we have that same language being used here. So right here at the end of chapter 19, in the aftermath of the judgment, we see the sea beast and the earth beast both being destroyed. Rome has been destroyed. The political headship and the authority that's being enforced by the emperor cult and the emperor worship, the false religion that surrounds that, those have gone away, along with the immorality of the empire. We talked about allies, and we talked about enemies. We have had 3 of our 4 enemies be dealt with. Rome has gone away. The last of these that must be dealt with is the dragon, which is Satan. This is the last of our enemies that has not been dealt with in this matter. I will make a note. Those first 3 obviously being references to Rome. We talked about that in our Allies and Enemies class. Rome has been done away with at this point in the book. Rome is gone. They have been removed from the picture. And I talked about this a little bit when we talked about the trumpets, but when we look back through history, we need to avoid making these things literal. These are not literal events that took place, and we've repeated that week after week. These things are not literal. We didn't literally have utter destruction and blood pouring out of the city of Rome. Rome was not wiped off the map instantly due to some miraculous event. We know that. But what we do know is the Roman Empire went away. If we look back in history, right around the time, shortly after Revelation was written, at the end of the 1st century, Rome began to go on a decline, and the empire began disappearing in certain segments. The empire went through natural disasters and earthquakes and things that brought on economic hardship. There was political corruption. Leaders came into power who, from the inside, tore the empire apart. You had other nations rising up that would attack Rome and take power for themselves and diminish the power that Rome had. Now, I'm not trying to link any of those events to the events here in the book, because I don't know which of those events God was a part of. But what we do know is the Roman Empire fell very shortly after, it began declining very shortly after this book was written. And God told us he had a hand in that. The Roman Empire has been dealt with. The Roman Empire, at this point in the book, is gone. Now we need to discuss what's going to happen to the dragon. which is where we're at in chapter 20. Let's go ahead and read chapter 20. We're discussing the fate of the dragon, the fate of Satan in this matter. Chapter 20. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding the key of the abyss and a great chain in his hand. And he laid hold of the dragon, the serpent of old, who is the devil and Satan, and bound him for 1,000 years. And he threw him into the abyss, and shut it, and sealed it over him, so that he would not deceive nations any longer, until the 1,000 years were completed. After these things, he must be released for a short time. Then I saw thrones, and they sat on them, and judgment was given to them. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded because of their testimony of Jesus, and because of the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or his image, and had not received the mark of the beast on their hand. They came to life and reigned with Christ for 1,000 years. The rest of the dead did not come to life until the 1,000 years were completed. This is the first resurrection. Blessed and holy is the one who has a part in the first resurrection. Over these the second death has no power. But they will be priests of God and of Christ, and will reign with him for 1,000 years. When the 1,000 years are completed, Satan will be released from his prison, and will come out to deceive the nations which are in the four corners of the earth, Gog and Magog, to gather them together for the war. And the number of them is like the sand of the seashore. And they came up from the broad plain of the earth, and surrounded the camp of the saints and the beloved city, and fire came down from heaven and devoured them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and the false prophet are also. And they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. Then I saw a great white throne, and him who sat on it, from whose presence earth and heaven fled away, and no place was found for them. And I saw the dead, the great and the small, standing before the throne, and books were open. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged from the things which were written in the books, according to their deeds. And the sea gave up the dead which were in it. And the death and Hades gave up the dead which were in them, and they were judged, every one of them according to their deeds. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. This is the second death, the lake of fire. And if anyone's name was not found written in the book of life, he was thrown into the lake of fire. As we said, we're discussing the fate of Satan. Within this context, there's a lot of confusion out in the world about this chapter. You probably recognized it as we were reading if you're at all familiar with what the world teaches from this book. This chapter is very widely misused. A lot of people focus entirely on verse 4, where we have this 1,000-year reign, and that reign is mentioned many times. This has been used to construct the bizarre and complicated theory known as premillennialism. We're not going to get into much detail about what that teaching entails. We're going to do that in our false doctrines class. But this entire system is based mostly on a single failure to understand the context of this chapter, to understand the meaning and correctly interpret this chapter, because a lot of it is centered around the 1,000-year reign. So it's important for us to rightly interpret this chapter, because if you haven't, you will experience people misuse this chapter in their teaching to you if you talk to people about Revelation. We've talked week after week about keeping the events that we're reading within their context, within the scope of what we've been reading, within the flow of thought that we've had progress from chapter to chapter. Coming out of the previous chapters, where we're talking about judgment on Rome. We were talking about Rome being dealt with and Rome going away and how that would affect this circumstance. Now we're talking about these actions being done to Satan. It has to make sense that as we go into this chapter, we're talking about we're talking about Satan in this matter with Rome. That's important. We have to understand the context. So as we look at what happens, first off, in the first 3 verses, we see that Satan is defeated. He's bound with this chain and thrown into an abyss for 1,000 years. So what does this symbolize? Obviously, this is not to be understood literally. This can't be literal. Satan is a spiritual being. He cannot be bound with a physical chain. So clearly we know that this is talking about something figurative. It can't be literal. But to answer what this does mean, again, keep context in mind. Satan has been using Rome to do his bidding. I gave you the illustration that all of these other beasts were his henchmen. They were working for him to do his bidding, and now all of those things have gone away. All of those beasts, all of those tools he has been using have gone away. He doesn't have them at his disposal. Now we learn in chapter 20 that Satan is bound. He is bound in the sense that God has taken away his resources. God has taken away his tools. God has taken away the things he's using to fulfill his evil schemes. That is, Rome. In that sense, he is bound. Not literally, but he is bound by having his resources and his ability to affect people taken away. And John adds that this binding is to last for 1,000 years. Again, we've seen the time periods mentioned over and over in this book, and they haven't been literal, so this one can't be literal either. We have to resist the urge to make this a literal time period. It's part of the symbol. Numbers have periodically meant something symbolic as we've seen them. So if we break down 1,000, we've seen some numbers similar to this. We talked about the 144,000. Broke that down. You'll remember my whole spiel about that and the word completion. I'll give it to you again. Now we have 1,000. 10 times 10 times 10. Completion times completion times completion. Again, we're reiterating the idea of completion. That's what this 1,000 years is. It's not a literal time period. It's completion. Satan is bound completely in this matter with Rome. It's over. There's nothing left. There's no more revisiting this topic. There's no more for Satan to reach down and grab Rome again and start doing things. He's completely bound. Those are completely removed from the table. Satan, in this matter, is completely defeated, which is in direct contrast to the next couple verses where the saints are victorious. We're looking at both sides here. Satan is completely destroyed, completely removed from his ability to use Rome. And so now John sees martyrs who died in this conflict with Rome, in this battle that's been taking place. And they're allowed to, they come to life, and they reign with Christ for 1,000 years. This is described as the first resurrection. And a blessing is pronounced for those who have part in this. Again, the symbolism. It symbolizes complete victory. God's people have victory for this 1,000-year reign. It's just the idea of completion. In this matter of Rome, God's people have complete victory. Doesn't matter if you lived through it. It doesn't matter if you died during it. You have complete victory in this circumstance. Verse 5, it's describing this as the first resurrection. We've seen resurrection before in the book. Back in chapter 11 with the witnesses. The witnesses were killed. It was talking about God's faithful people were killed, but they were resurrected. The cause of Christ was resurrected. God's people were resurrected. That's the same thing we're looking at here with this resurrection. The cause of Christ is being resurrected and brought back to life. They were dead. It seemed as if Rome had stamped out their life and removed them and made them lose, but that's not what happened. They had complete victory. To avoid making mistakes of others, let's notice a couple things. This is not talking about the end of time. This is not talking about Jesus' coming at the end of time. We're talking about this battle with Rome. That's what we're talking about in this victory. They had victory in this matter. We're not looking at the end of time. We're not talking about the final judgment. It's this matter. Keep it within its context. This is Satan's defeat with Rome. This is God's people's victory over Rome. Second, this is not something that's talking about us. We can't make this 1,000-year reign that's being discussed relate to us and talk about us. We can learn things from it, maybe make application that we'll talk about next week from it. But this isn't about us. This is talking about the martyrs, the people who died at the hands of Rome, who died in this battle that they're facing. Again, context, 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 emphasizing that. It's important. It prevents us from making wrong interpretations about this chapter. Again, the 1,000 years is not literal. It's a complete defeat. It's a complete victory, depending on the side that you're on. It's all part of the symbolism. The next section, Satan makes a comeback. This is another reason to say that we're not talking about the end of time. There's more to follow. Satan's not done. There's more that's coming. At the end of the 1,000 years, Satan is released. And again, he's able to deceive nations and make war with the people of God. But we'll note that the outcome is the same. Satan makes a comeback, but he's still defeated. Again, the symbolism. Satan is down, but he's not out. The vision of him being released here simply symbolizes his continued struggle against God's people. Satan was completely defeated in the matter of Rome, but that's not the end of Satan. Still today in our time, Satan's still here, so he couldn't have been completely destroyed back at the time of the Roman Empire. He was totally defeated in that scenario, but he continued forward. There's a lot of references here. I don't want you to get tripped up on a lot of them. For example, Gog and Magog. Satan will go on to use Gog and Magog to do his bidding. Gog and Magog is simply a reference to the Old Testament. In Ezekiel, Gog and Magog are two symbols that are used simply to symbolize the enemies of God's people. This is simply saying that Satan will continue on and he'll find new enemies of God's people to use to do his bidding. All of the beasts and things he was using with Rome are gone, but he'll find something else. He's going to find a new way to attack God's people. He's not done. He's not giving up. That's all that Gog and Magog are. And we're familiar with that idea. I mean, Satan today uses all kinds of different things and weapons to assault us and to assault our faith. We have atheism, materialism, media, worldly relationships, all of these things that Satan uses to attack us. Those are Gog and Magog. It's anything he can use against God's people. Despite this, this section not only warns of the devil's ongoing work, it not only warns of Satan's continuing struggle with God's people, but it also gives promise. It also promises that at the end of time, God will eventually stop Satan completely. Satan's going to be allowed to continue on fighting God's people, but eventually God will put a stop to that completely. It will be completely done. There will come a day when Satan is completely destroyed and prevented from in any way hurting God's people. We're not there yet, but that will come. It's important to note, we've been talking about our keys and the time frame and the background and style and all of these things. It is important to note here that we're doing something interesting with our time frame. And by interesting, I mean we're breaking our time frame. We're getting outside of the time frame of the book of Revelation, but we have to understand why we're allowed to do that in this spot in the book and why we're not allowed to do it previously. Up to this point, it looks like, let me say this. Like I said, Satan was not destroyed. Satan was not utterly destroyed. He would continue on after this event with Rome. He would find other ways to defeat God's people. But that doesn't give the book closure. To give the book closure, we want to know, well, what's going to happen to Satan in the end? We've talked a little bit in chapters 2 and 3 and things about what will happen in the end for God's people. They were promised heaven and other promises to go with that, the crown and eternal life and things. We want to know what's going to happen to Satan at the end of time. In order to discuss the end of Satan, you have to move past the time frame of talking about Rome, because it didn't happen in that time frame. All of the other enemies and the things we've talked about were Rome. So you did have to stay within that time frame to talk about them. But the end of Satan didn't happen in the first century. We know that. So we're now forced to move out of our time frame to discuss one subject. What will happen to those who live past this section? It's important. Having been forced to deal with Satan's end, John will continue to look at the end. At the end of time, now we are looking at the end of time, that's when Satan will be dealt with completely. Not yet in this matter, at the end of time. But there's also some other individuals who will be dealt with at the end of time. And that's Gog and Magog. That's the earth dwellers. Every other evil person or every other enemy of God's people, at the end of time, everything's going to be dealt with. Everything is going to be separated to heaven or to hell. That's going to take place at the end of time. So John will take this moment to discuss that, because that's important. Because the saints in Asia Minor, they want to know what's going to happen to Rome, but now we've discussed that. So now they want to know, well, what about the end? What about our promise, our eternal lives? What is it that we're striving towards? What is it that we're working so hard for? What is it that makes all of this suffering worth it? That's the question that's going to be answered. But again, to answer that, we have to look forward past the time frame. And that's the only reason we're allowed to go past the time frame here and not prior in the book. So let's keep that specification in mind. And we're going to move forward a little bit. So you get to the end of this section where we do talk about judgment. And now, because of what I just said, we are talking about final judgment. Because that's when all of the extra enemies of God's people will be dealt with. That's when God's people will finally receive the reward of heaven. And when all of this will change. Yes? Yeah.
It's fair to say that at the end of verse 6-ish, or 7 of chapter 20, the purpose stated in the beginning of the book for which these keys we laid out have ended. And that's why outside the boundaries that we set forward.
Yes. Yes. So the subject is somewhat changing that we've been talking about. The whole purpose of the book, like we said, was given with the keys, given in chapter 1. Now we're taking a second to discuss something that won't just affect these people. So in that sense, yes, we are allowed to break those keys in some sense, but because there's a purpose to it. And it still fits within the scope of the book, the whole reason the book was written. It's not something completely separate. Did that kind of go where you were thinking? Anybody else have any comments or questions? I hope that was somewhat clear, everything we said.
Just a quick comment about the 1,000-year reign.
Yeah.
I've had through the years, and certain people will come to your door and they get people all confused about this.
Mm-hmm.
An easy way to refute that and confuse them a little bit based on their premillennial doctrine is just to point out in these first 10 verses all the things they need to make that work are not these verses. You mentioned the end of time. You don't,
Yeah.
you don't have the bodily resurrection. You don't have a literal throne of David. You don't have Jerusalem and Palestine. You don't actually even have the reign of Christ on earth. It doesn't say on earth. You don't have the conversion of the Jews, which they claim was necessary. And you don't have the church on earth. Yeah. And so to build a doctrine around a passage where you have none of those main components is pretty spurious doctrine, I would say.
Yeah, there's a lot of stuff missing to make that doctrine be something that's truth. Hold that thought. We're going to talk about that in 2 weeks. When we talk about false doctrines, one of them will be premillennialism. We'll discuss the 1,000-year reign and more, and we'll kind of break that doctrine down a little bit more. So if you're interested, be here in 2 weeks. Let's see. Are there any other comments or anything before we move on? Yeah.
A brief comment. I found it interesting in just studying Matthew 8, verse 29, where the demons know about this torment that's coming. So this is not unknown in the spiritual realm that this is going to happen. Satan and his demons already know about it, and they address that with Jesus when he's here. Are you here to take his torment before the time?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a lot of these things are, they're not new ideas in the book of Revelation. Jesus taught some of these things in a little bit different way, but he talked about them in his ministry, and the Old Testament alluded to a lot of these things, and so Stephen's right. Yeah, a lot of this isn't new, and in the spiritual realm, they knew about those things. Again, it's not new to anybody. God's just giving a little more clarity on the situation and what would happen. Yeah.
Read the end of verse 10. I find it helpful to kind of help me and others recognize that hell is not what the world portrays hell to be. The devil is not sitting on a throne and where he's just kind of like waiting, hey, it's party time, come on over, these kind of things. He's in torment, and he's there first. And then comes the judgment of all the others. And they and weeping and gnashing of teeth. What the Bible portrays hell to be in this final time. And this is where we see the combination of death, Hades, all these things, all that goes away. This is now comes hell.
Yeah.
There's another person that is in torment in there.
Yeah. Yeah, the book gives us very clear insight into what hell is, right? And that's a great point. Satan is there being tormented the same as everyone else. People often picture hell as a place where you can go to continue your evil lifestyle with Satan in charge. And, well, that's not it. It's suffering for everyone, Satan included. It's his punishment, too. Great clarification. We're going to move on for the sake of time. So we've dealt with all of our enemies. Now the question is the ultimate fate at this final judgment for God's people. Again, like I said, what is it that they have to look forward to? What is it that God's people have to look forward to? What can they use as motivation to stay faithful, to stay strong in the Word of God, and not to depart from Him? Well, that's what we're going to discuss as the book closes, as we go into chapter 21. It's the fate of the saints. We've discussed the fate of everyone else, so it's only fair to discuss their fate. Let me give you a quick little blurb here I want to throw in. I realize that at times this class may be frustrating. It's difficult to tackle a book like Revelation and discuss every little detail that's discussed. So I know we've skipped over a lot of little details that you may want to discuss. However, before we can really take on the task of those details, it's important to know the big picture. And that's kind of the approach we've taken, is getting the big picture so that at a later date we can go in and maybe look at some more details. So if there's still specific places in the book you don't entirely understand, it's okay, don't fret. You've got the big picture. You've got the point. And we can study those details at another time. So I say that to add that the study of these next chapter and a half is going to be no different. We're going to skip over a lot of details you may want to talk about to get the big picture. Let's just go ahead and read it before I say anything else. We're going to read the entire thing. There is a lot of detail, but what I want you to do, instead of getting hung up on the detail, just picture it. Just visualize it in your head. I've asked you to do that periodically as I've read things, so do the same thing. If you'd rather not look at your Bible and just listen and picture the things that I'm reading, feel free. But let's read chapter 21 and into 22. Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth passed away, and there is no longer any sea. And I saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, made ready as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is among men, and he will dwell among them, and they shall be his people, and God himself will be among them. And he will wipe away every tear from their eyes, and there will be no longer any death, there will no longer be any pain, or mourning, or crying. These first things have passed away. And he who sits on the throne said, Behold, I am making all things new. And he said, Write, for these words are faithful and true. Then he said to me, It is done. I am the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end. I will give to the one who thirsts from the spring of water of life without cost. He who overcomes will inherit these things, and I will be his God, and he will be my son. But for the cowardly and unbelieving and abominable and murderers and immoral persons and sorcerers and idolaters and liars, there will be in the lake that burns with fire and brimstone their part, which is the second death. Then one of the 7 angels, who had the 7 bowls full of the 7 last plagues, came and spoke with me, saying, Come here, I will show you the bride, the wife, and the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to the great and high mountain, and showed me the holy city, Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, having the glory of God. Her brilliance was like a very costly stone, and a stone of crystal clear jasper. It had a great and high wall and 12 gates, and at the gates 12 angels. And the names were written on them, which are the names of the 12 tribes of the sons of Israel. There were 3 gates on the east, and 3 gates on the north, and 3 on the south, and 3 on the west. And the wall of the city had 12 foundation stones, and on them were the 12 names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. The one who spoke with me had a gold measuring rod to measure the city and its gates and its wall. The city is laid out as a square, and its length is as great as its width. And he measured the city with the rod, 1,500 miles, its length, and width and height are equal. And he measured its wall, 72 yards, according to human measurements, which are also angelic measurements. The material of the wall was jasper, and the city was pure gold, like clear glass. The foundation stones of the city wall were adorned with every kind of precious stone. The first foundation stone was jasper, the second sapphire, the third chalcedony, the fourth emerald, the fifth sardonyx, the sixth sardius, the seventh chrysolite, the 8th beryl, the 9th topaz, 10th chrysoprase, the 11th jacinth, and the 12th amethyst. And the 12 gates were 12 pearls, and each one of the gates was a single pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold, like transparent glass. I saw no temple in it, for the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb are its temple. And the city has no need for the sun or the moon to shine on it, for the glory of God has illuminated it, and its lamp is the Lamb. The nations will walk by its light, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. In the daytime, for there will be no night there, its gates will never be closed. And they will bring the glory and honor of the nations into it. And nothing unclean, and no one who practices abomination and lying shall ever come into it, but only those whose names are written in the Lamb's book of life. Then he showed me a river of water of life, clear as crystal, coming up from the throne of God and of the Lamb. In the middle of its street, on either side of the river, was the tree of life, bearing 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the trees were for the healing of the nations. There will no longer be any curse, and the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his bondservants will serve him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads. And there will no longer be any night, and they will not have the need of light or lamp, nor the light of the sun, because the Lord God will illumine them, and they will reign forever and ever. What we've just read about is heaven. We got to see a glimpse into heaven. That's what John got to see, and that's what he's describing to us here. Again, we're going to avoid a lot of detail, but let's paint the picture. The things that John sees a new heaven and a new earth. Let's just go and describe it. A new heaven and a new earth. He sees New Jerusalem, a holy city coming down from heaven. The description, there's a lot of stuff up there, I won't read all of it, but the description of this holy city is great. It's brilliant. There's walls and gates and foundations, the size of it. No wicked shall ever enter. There's a river of life coming out of it. I mean, we just read it all, so I'm not going to repeat it. But we have this very grand image of this holy city. Let's note some of the things that John hears. First, John hears in verse 3 and 4 that God is among his people. John is told and is telling us God will be there. No more just hearing from God or reading from his word or praying to him. He is there with his people. And God guarantees that these things will come. Everyone who is faithful will get to take part. There will be nothing bad here. All tears, sorrow, pain, everything is going away. All that's left is this wonderful, great paradise consisting of nothing but God's people who are faithful to him. Symbolism, as a general big picture, is fairly easy. We're talking about heaven. We're talking about the reward that these people have to look forward to, what they get to experience at the end of time. Like I said, there's a lot of details, but all of these details, if we sum them up into a couple points, that's what I'm going to do, bring about some very powerful thoughts and very powerful messages for these people. We see perfect fellowship in heaven for those people who have felt alone on earth during all of this suffering. We see perfect happiness for everyone who has suffered, lost, experienced grief through all of these times. All of that's going away. There's perfect security for anyone who felt unsafe, for anyone who felt uncertain about how their life would turn out or the lives of their family. Perfect security with no worries. Perfect provision for anyone who suffered great need, who stayed up at night wondering how they would provide for themselves or their family. There's none of that in heaven. Perfect fellowship, perfect happiness, perfect security, perfect provision. Heaven's going to be a great place. Heaven's going to be an awesome place. This is the real point of the vision that's being explained here, is this grand image of something to look forward to. It's not as superficial as just these literal streets of gold and things that people paint pictures of heaven. Those things are great, but that's missing the point. We're not looking forward to gold streets and pearly gates and the pretty things around us. Those aren't things that matter. Those things are providing for us this message that heaven is great. Heaven is perfect. This is what you look forward to. The saints of Asia Minor are listening to this knowing we've got to go out tomorrow and deal with Rome. Because these things are coming soon, and they know that. But here's the hope. Through the end of this matter, as they go through this last and final experience with Rome, this is what they have to hold on to. This is what they have to look forward to, which is why it's given to them right here at the close of the book. We'll wrap up the last chapter of the book next week, and we'll also start our application study next week as well. So be prepared for that. Thank you.